Here is a blue ink by Organic Studios Accident.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
There is an incredible amount of permanence here. I wasn't expecting, and it did really well with that. The swatch is definitely blue, and sometimes in the writing, it made me think of a turquoise. Yet, I still enjoyed it, and considering I don't tend to go for turquoise inks, that's pretty good. As a permanent blue, it keeps shading better than most permanent blue inks that I've tried. Huge plus there, especially for someone like me that loves shading. There also is only a slight tone variation by pen on the majority. Like, you'll see a big difference of soft fine to wet fine. This might have become my favorite permanent blue because of the shading it has, which it's just decent shading. It's not like it's amazing shading, but it's still there and it's still doing a very good job.
The pen for today is a Kaweco Sport. All of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib which writes rather dry, a Hero 7035 with a fine nib that writes wet, a Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib and an average flow, a Lamy Safari with a broad nib that writes average. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is hopefully coming through on camera. It is a very light blue. This is the lightest that we really do get. It is readable to me in purpose. It's not feathering or spreading. It is shading pretty well, especially it's a very dry pen. You see it in him, you see it in the, dim, light. Almost every word does have a bit of shading, which is very nice. I just wish here it was a little bit darker. Looking at the wet fine, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it is shading. This is the darkest version of this blue that we're going to get. And I don't want to say tons darker, but it is the darkest version. So it's to keep in mind because it's going to step down just a little bit in darkness of its tone as we do change some of these pens. Looking at the medium, it is a little lighter than we had with the wet fine, quite a bit darker still than we had with the soft fine. Really right in the middle of those two. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it is shading very well. Again, as I had mentioned, I was surprised how well it shades, and you can see that it's not like it's standout amazing shading. But for a permanent ink, it's shading well beyond what we've normally seen. Looking at the broad nib, it is only a tad bit lighter than it was with the medium. It does not feather, does not spread. The shading, I think, shows up a little bit better. Look at Keeley, starts a little darker in the K, goes to a mid-tone, very dark on the eye, especially dots of eyes are quite a bit dark with this ink. But you see it show itself very well. I think the shading showed better in the wet fine. The shading showed about as well in the soft fine, so it holds shading in a fairly consistent way. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and have no problems back here.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle.
This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelikan M1000. Here's the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There was approximately 8 milliliters of ink left.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade, not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, but it does shade. Look at flutes, look at inside, look at bomber. All of them are shading well. All the rest of the words are shading well also. Still a very light tone on the paper. It's usable. I don't want a whole page of this tone as light as it is, though. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is much darker than it was with the soft fine, the same tone that it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather just a little bit. You see it on a Bilfer, on the F. Of course, my hand got a little wonky there. But I do see some feathers. I don't know if that's me or feathering. Let's call that me inside on the ink. It does not spread. It is shading, and I think it is shading a little bit better than it did on the Clairfontaine. It's just more noticeable. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than we had with the wet fine, a little bit lighter. It is the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade. And again, I think the shading is showing up a little better here than it did on the Clairfontaine. Not something you really expect from a non-fountain pen paper for it to outperform in shading than it did on one of the best fountain pen papers on the market, or at least my opinion of them. Looking at the broad nib, it is just a tad bit lighter than it was with the medium. It is the same tone as it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather. It does not spread. It does give little bits of shading, about the same amount of shading that we got on the Clairfontaine. Same thing happens. Very small things like dots of eyes or the exclamation points, quotation marks. Very dark. Not very much shading within the writing itself, which is the same thing that happened on the Clairfontaine. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting, no problem writing back here.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, while it's the same darkness that we had on the Clairfontaine, it certainly is turquoise here and not a blue. This is an effect of the color of the paper, showing that the ink itself is a little bit more translucent than opaque. Now, it's not feathering, it's not spreading. It does shade, though not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. Some of that might be eaten up by the paper. Look at that on the top line. Starts light, gets dark to light to dark again, all in one word. Second line, the, goes lighter to darker, so it is shading here very well, though. Looking at the wet fine, quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine, a little bit darker than we had on the Clairfontaine. We are seeing a bit of that turquoise lean in it, again, an effect from the paper. Now, it is not feathering, it is not spreading. We see the slightest bit of tone variation when we get onto the third or fourth line, not in the very beginning when the pen got to sit for just a moment between papers. Looking at the medium nib, lighter than it was with the wet fine, A little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Definitely turquoise, not a blue. It does not feather, it does not spread. It shades better than it did in the other papers. That turquoise really brought out some of its shading. You see it in shadows. Were, lost, and still they played on. Well, on didn't have it, but almost every other word does have shading, and it does look very nice. Just don't use it on this paper and expect blue. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium. It is turquoise, not blue. That is an effect of the paper, not the ink. Still, there is no feather, there is no spread. The shading is the same as it was on the other papers. The only place you get it is where it crosses, like in Deep Throated, it's singing, get your mind out of the gutter. When the T crosses the H, you see it get darker, or dots of eyes, things like that. Looking at the back of the page, you see we have no bleeding, no ghosting. Makes this amazing to use on so many papers.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine, which is the same tone as the Portage. It does not feather, it does not spread. It does shade just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, which is a little less than it did in the Portage Reporter Notebook. There is no spread. I said there's no spread. It's still a very light blue. Looking at the wet fine nib, it's quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine. Same tone as the Portage, same tone as the Clairfontaine. Still, I think one of the nicer tones we're getting here. It's not feathering, it's not spreading. In this case, I'm not seeing any shading at all, where I definitely saw the shading much more in the Clairfontaine. Mostly what we're getting here is the dark tone. I'm going to take back a little bit of what I said on the shading, because look at Thorin, starts dark and gets light. Look at Golden, starting lighter, getting darker. Looking at the medium nib, a little bit lighter than we had with the soft fine. Same exact tone as the Clairfontaine. There's no feather, there is no spread, there's no shading here at all. And this is where I do think the tone is looking its best. I wish it had the shading on the Rhodia that it kind of gave, but it does shade, just not on here, not this paper. Looking at the broad nib, it is just a tad bit lighter than it was with the medium. Same tone as the Clairfontaine. To draw attention here, this is really the broad is where I see that little bit of a turquoise lean in that tone, though nothing comes through for the chromatography on it. That's fine. There's no feather, there is no spread. The only shading, just as the Clairfontaine, is dots of eyes, periods, commas, that sort of thing. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting, outstanding performance.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Ackerman, their number 6 Benahoff Blues. Here is Caran d'Ache Magnetic Blue. Here is Diamine Washable Blue. Here is Mont Blanc BMW. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, which is unfortunate. I don't think you're really seeing me. I think you're seeing me right. I haven't seen the footage yet. I'm hoping you see it. It is very light. I don't want a whole page of it. I don't like the color in how it is with the soft fine. It is just too darn light. Now, it is not feathering, it is not spreading, it is shading just a little bit. I just don't like how it looks in the soft fine, personally, because I don't want a whole page of it. I don't think it's horrible. Definitely not for me. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit easier to read because of how much darker it is than the soft fine. A little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does not shade. It looks just as a blue here. This is the effect the paper is having on the ink. I think as permanent as this ink is on this paper makes it a really good match for if you're working in a lab. Convenient, since it's a lab notebook. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little bit lighter than it was with the wet fine. A little bit, as in more than a little bit, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, it does shade fairly consistently. If you see it in ringing, you see it in bells and in, you see it a lot of where you turn on your letters. So the turn of the B into the E of bells, or the turn at the top of the I on in, that's where you start to see some of the shading here. Anywhere that you would have had a momentary pause. It's subtle. It's doing well. Looking at the broad nib, it is just a tad bit lighter than it was with the medium. It is quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather. It does not spread. It does not shade, except for those dots of I's or commas. And there's one time it shaded in a letter, and that's the end of the N in golden. So I'm going to leave it as not shading. Looking at the back of the page, you see that ghosting is way under control, as it is not ghosting, and there is no bleed through, making it an amazing student ink.
While it's nice to see color comparables, I prefer to see an ink that complements the color on the page. Here is a pink ink by Lamy Rhodonite. Here is an orange ink by Noodler's Apache Sunset. Here is a magenta ink by Papier Plume Burgundy. Here is a yellow ink by Califolio Bouton d'Or. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is incredibly the same tone as the Clairfontaine. Now it does have, does not feather. It does have a little bit of spread. It does shade, and I think a little bit better than it did on the Clairfontaine, which tends to make me weary about copy paper. I'm worried about it bleeding because, man, I'm on the side of this ink. I want it to do well on copy paper. Looking at the wet fine nib, quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine, a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather. It does spread to a little bit more than a medium. It does not shade. It's very dark, distinctive blue on the page. Considering it's copy paper, I think that's pretty darn good. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine. It is just a little bit lighter and flatter in tone than it was on the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather. Amazing, because this is the third time I've said that on this paper for this ink. Amazing. It does have the slightest spread. It's about at a broad. It doesn't really shade, as in it gets those dots and commas and the end of the F of on the second line, but doesn't really shade. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as it was with the medium. It is a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather. Again, this ink has not feathered on this paper. Can we say that that's pretty much a winner right there? And if it doesn't bleed, this ink is the god of 20-pound paper. Oh my goodness. It does spread a little bit. It only shades at commas or dots. I think what we're seeing in performance is truly great. I don't normally show the page underneath when there is nothing on it, but look at how much of nothing there is underneath there. And look at the ghosting, well under control. There is, you can write back here, this ink is the god of 20-pound paper. Don't be offended by religion if you're religious or if you're not. I think this ink is doing an amazing job on 20-pound paper. Look at the back of the page.
So what nib and pen do I recommend using for this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
I think this ink is always looking and performing well, except an extreme case of a dry, soft, fine. It's a very dry, very fine pen to write with. Other than that, I think it could easily be a dealer's choice. Yet for me, I think the best tone of this with the best shading comes from a medium flow, medium nib. It is the Goldilocks of inks. Really, it is. It's just right. And the fact of how well it did on copy paper really makes me looking at this ink and saying, I don't need permanent ink all the time, but I almost feel like there's a need to get a hold of a bottle of this because of how amazing it really did on accident. I don't think it was an accident. I think it's a great name.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching.